If I was to ask you, who are you? Like, who are you really? What would you say? Maybe you'd say, I'm a teacher, or I'm a chef, or I'm an accountant. Or maybe your go-to is your relationship status. I'm a husband, I'm a mother, or I'm a grandparent. Or maybe you'd identify with a hobby or a passion of yours. I'm a cyclist, I'm a gamer, or I'm a gardener. See, there are 1,000 tiny little things that all contribute in making you, you. From your family of origin, your cultural background, your education, your job, your passions, your significant other, your kids, to your fears, your anxieties, your hopes and dreams for the future. All of these things are like tiny little puzzle pieces. Zoom into each of them in isolation and you're not going to see that much, but if you put them all together, they'll form an image of you. Have you ever considered what the most important piece of your puzzle is? Have you ever stopped to think, if I was to boil down all the things that make me, me, what would be left? Yeah, sure, maybe you're a mechanic, a retail worker, a nurse, but is that all there is to you? Or maybe you're a mum, a grandfather, or an auntie, but is that all you are? Or maybe you're Maori, Samoan, or Pakeha, but again, is that all you are? In other words, what foundation is your life built on? Is it your culture, your profession, your family? Or maybe it's your physical possessions, your finances, your wealth, or perhaps your lack thereof. Perhaps if you were really honest, you'd admit that your life is kind of built on keeping up with the Joneses. The pursuit, the endless pursuit of the accumulation of stuff, of having the nicest car, being able to go on the nicest holidays and having the nicest house on the street. Or perhaps your foundation isn't material, but emotional. Maybe you were hurt a long, long time ago, and at the core of you is fear. Fear that if you take a risk, you'll get hurt. Fear that if your perfect world is disrupted, everything will collapse. Fear that if you open yourself up to new things, to new people, to new experiences, you'll just end up having to revisit that trauma all over again. The truth is, this foundational driver that sits at the core of our being, over time, it begins to tell a story. It's a story that you tell to yourself and that others tell about you. This story influences every part of your life, whether you know it or not. It influences your relationship with money. It influences who you choose to spend your life with. It influences how you raise your children and the kind of friends that you keep. It influences how you relate to people who aren't like you. It's a story about who you are, why you're here, and how you fit into this wonderful mosaic that we call the human race. Let me share a little bit of my story with you. See, I grew up in the 90s, and like many kids who grew up in the 90s, I was outside most of the time. If I could have eaten and slept outside, I would have. And when I was outside, one of the things I loved to do the most was ride my bike. My friends and I were seldom off our bikes, and we would always go up and down the street, visit each other's houses, go down to the corner shop, all on our bikes. It was the way that we got around, and we felt cool doing it. But there was one day of the week where I was not allowed to ride my bike. See, if you didn't grow up as Seventh-day Adventist Christian, you may not know that we as Seventh-day Adventists celebrate the Sabbath on Saturday, the seventh day of the week. And when I was growing up, it was a day where you were not allowed to ride your bike. There are many wonderful things about the Sabbath that I love now, but when I was a kid, all I really cared about was what you couldn't do on the Sabbath. And riding your bike was one of them. However, I have to admit that I was a little bit rebellious, and my parents had a much more laissez-faire approach to riding bikes, and so they kind of let us get away with it. One day, one Sabbath afternoon, after we had a bunch of people over at our house and we'd eaten our lunch and we were all outside playing, we were playing cops and robbers. And as I was tearing down our driveway, our long gravel driveway, I was chasing one of my friends on his bike. And as I was chasing my friend on his bike, I didn't notice that I was coming up on a pretty deep pothole. And as I raced towards it, my bike's front tire went straight into that pothole. And where did I go? Straight over the handlebars, face first into the ground. My face was all scratched up. My chin was cut open. In fact, if you meet me in real life one day, you will actually be able to see the scar that I still have from that incident. And I remember my dad dragging me off the ground and taking me to hospital, where I had to get my face glued up with this medical glue that hurt a lot. And then the annoyance of having to dress the wound for the next couple weeks. It was annoying. But deeper than that was the story I told myself about that incident. So why am I telling you all of this? Well, that experience became a story for me. My faith community, they had told me that riding my bike on the Sabbath was against the rules. They'd also told me that God, he punishes people who break his rules. And therefore, you might be able to put the pieces together, so to speak, of the story that I told myself. The story I told myself was this: God is like an angry dad. He punishes people who break his rules, and if I break God's rules, he's going to punish me too. Therefore, what do I need to do? I know that I'm never going to be enough unless I follow all of God's rules to the letter. And that was the story I told myself. And to be honest, that's the story that a lot of people like me still tell themselves to this very day. You know, I tried my best to follow God's rules, to be a good little boy, to be the kind of little boy that God would accept, that God would love. But no matter what I did, I realized over time that I was doomed to failure. No matter how good I was always going to mess up. It was inevitable. No matter how much I tried to fight my temptations to do the right thing, I knew that one day, inevitably, I'd slip up. And eventually, I came to the conclusion that nothing that I did would ever be enough to please God. And I came to another conclusion as well. Because of this story that I told myself that I would never be enough for God. See, the trouble with what I was doing was that I was telling myself a bad story. Everything that I had ever tried to do, trying to be good for God, was doomed to failure from the start. I tried so hard, and I told myself the same story over and over and over again, hoping that one day I would be able to be enough, to do enough, to be acceptable in God's eyes. But the story was a bad one. It wasn't a good story. And as I said, it's a story that many people tell themselves even to this day. And it took a long time for me to realize that the problem wasn't with me. The problem wasn't with me not being good enough. The problem wasn't with me not, trying hard enough. What I didn't need was more discipline or a new hack or a new way to be the kind of person that God wanted me to be. What I really, truly needed was a new story. So, let's talk about your story again. And I want to go back to the beginning and ask that same question one more time, which is, if you've forgotten, what is the foundation that your life is built on? Is it built on your job? Is it built on your family? Is it built on your hobby or a passion? Is it built on money, material wealth? Or is it built on any number of other things? See, the problem with basing our identity in these things is that they're fleeting. They don't last. They're here today and they're gone tomorrow. One day, you've got a stable job, and the next, the economy has crashed, your company is slashing all its workers, and boom, you're unemployed. One day, you've got a beautiful family, a spouse who loves you, and the next, your loved one decides they don't want to be with you anymore. Or one day, you're enjoying your hobby, and then life gets busy, and you don't have time for it anymore, or maybe your social group moves on. If we base our identity on things that don't last, then one day, inevitably, the carpet is going to be pulled from under our feet, and we're going to be left wondering, who am I? When the kids leave for university, who am I going to become? If I lose the passion for my hobby, who will I become? If I go through a breakup, who will I become? If I get let go from my job, who will I become? If we base our identity on something that doesn't last, we'll never be satisfied in life. And we'll always be chasing the next thing, latching on to anything that we can to give us meaning and give us purpose. The story that we tell about ourselves and about the world, that story matters. Your story matters. And what you don't need, what I don't need, is a shaky story. One that's just going to crumble when life gets hard. No, what you and I both need is a story that won't move, that won't be shaken by the storms of life. We need a story that we can rely on in the good times, but especially in the bad. Well, I've got good news, because there is a better story out there, a story that can become each of our story as well. See, about 2,000 years ago, there lived a man named Saul of Tarsus. Saul was a devout Jew. He was incredibly devoted to his faith, but he was also a vehement anti-Christian. He hated Christians. He thought that they were heretics. He thought that they were just coming to disrupt and to destroy the faith and the culture that he so loved. And so, as a devout Jew and as a supporter of his faith and his people, Saul went on a campaign trying to destroy the Christian faith as much as he could. He went from door to door, throwing Christians into prison, beating them up, breaking up gatherings. Wherever he went, he was trying to destroy the Christian faith. He even offered to hold the coats of some men, a mob that was murdering the first Christian martyr, a guy by the name of Stephen. He hated Christians. So, suffice to say, Paul was kind of a bad dude, even though he thought that he was doing the right thing. He believed with all of his might that he was on God's side. But one day, as Saul is on the road to a city named Damascus, something happens. He's there to try and break up more Christian groups. He is taking persecution on the road, but he encounters somebody that he never thought that he would encounter. He encounters the risen Jesus. Out of nowhere, Jesus appears to Saul, and he is blinded. But not just is he blinded, more importantly, in his meeting with the risen Jesus, Saul undergoes a dramatic change of heart, because he is confronted with the very man whose followers he is persecuting. And in this meeting and in the days afterward, as he meets with other Christians and he is introduced to their way of life, he is convinced of something. He's convinced that Jesus really was the Anointed One, the Messiah, and the Son of God. And so, when Saul recovers his blindness a few days later, he turns from being the Christian movement's number one enemy to its number one evangelist. He changes his name from Saul to Paul, and he sets out on a brand new mission. He travels from city to city, spreading the good news about Jesus and telling everybody that he can that Jesus died and rose from the dead, so that every person who trusts in him can receive eternal life and can be part of God's brand new creation family. On one such occasion, Paul is in the city of Athens, the capital of Greece. Athens, it's a massive city, and even 2,000 years ago, it was a bustling, multicultural, multi-ethnic, multi-faith metropolis. It also is the center of the known world for philosophy, for education, for brand new ideas. And the place in Athens where all of this was concentrated was the Areopagus. The Areopagus, also called Mars Hill by the Romans, was an enormous rock in the middle of the city where philosophers would debate ideas. In fact, the biblical text tells us that all the Athenians and all the foreigners who lived there spent their time doing nothing more but talking about and listening to all of the latest ideas. And so, as Paul is in Athens and he's preaching the good news, and as he's telling people about Jesus, a group of philosophers, some Stoics and some Epicureans, they start listening to Paul and they start debating with him. And he's sharing his ideas and they're sharing their ideas. And eventually they decide, you know what we need to do? We need to take this guy to the Areopagus because he needs to be heard and he needs to be exposed to all of the thinkers, all the theologians, all of the philosophers that Athens has to offer. And so they take him to the Areopagus. And I'm so fascinated by what Paul says when he is standing in the midst of all of these philosophers and all of these thinkers. If you want to find it, you can find it in Acts chapter 17. Paul says this, starting from verse 22. Athenians, I see how extremely religious you are in every way. For as I went through the city and looked carefully at the objects of your worship, I found among them an altar with the inscription, to an unknown God. What therefore you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it, he is the Lord of heaven and earth. And he does not live in shrines made by human hands, nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mortals life and breath and all things. From one ancestor he made all nations to inhabit the whole earth, and he allotted the times of their existence and the boundaries of the places where they would live, so that they would search for God and perhaps grope for him and find him, though indeed he is not far from each one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being, as even some of your own poets have said, for we too are his offspring. Now, there's a lot in that passage, but I just want to focus on one part of it. The part where Paul says of God, he gives himself to all mortals life and breath and all things. And here I just want to acknowledge, maybe you don't believe in God. Maybe you're skeptical about God. Or maybe you have trouble believing in a good God like I did when I was a kid. And if that's you, then this idea can be revolutionary. And it certainly was revolutionary for me. Because in the passage before this one, Paul, he makes the point that the God of heaven and earth, he doesn't need temples. He doesn't need silver or gold, or he doesn't need to be served by humans. Why? Well, because he himself is the source of all life. The life of humans, animals, plants, everything. He doesn't need you to build him a massive temple to live in, though places like this are absolutely beautiful. But he doesn't need it because he has already created the most incredible temple, and that's the universe. The place where you live, where you have your stuff, where you have your loved ones. And he doesn't need an army of servants to wait on him because he has already given all of himself in the person of Jesus. The thing that changed everything for me is this, that God doesn't need your good deeds because he is goodness himself. But it gets better, because Paul here is claiming that because God is the creator of all things, our story, it does actually start with us. It starts with God. And we're going to discover in the next episode that there's an ancient story about our origins that has the potential to change the way you think about your story today. But we'll get to that next time. But here's the thing. When I was a kid, the story that my faith community told me about God, a lot of it was good. I learned about Jesus. I learned about the love that he has for me. But there's some other stuff that was kind of thrown into the mix that really doesn't belong there. When I was a kid, I was told that God punishes people who break his laws. And yeah, that kind of happens sometimes in the Bible. And it's easy to understand why somebody might take that on and make that a part of their life. But as a kid, it made me afraid. It made me afraid of my church. It made me afraid of the people there. And most importantly, it made me afraid of God. It made me afraid that if I messed up, that if I did anything wrong, that God was going to come down with the hammer and he was going to punish me. And that story that I shared about my bike, I viewed that for years as God's punishment for me making a bad choice, for messing up, for doing the wrong thing. But that image of God, that picture of the punishing God, the angry God, the grumpy God, the disappointed dad, that's not really the picture of God that I see when I read the Bible now. When I read the Bible now, I see the same God that Paul fell in love with, and the same God that Paul is trying to communicate to the Athenians. He's a God who is so close, you and I, we could reach out and touch him. He's a God who will never abandon me and will never abandon you. He's a God who is loving and is so sacrificial that he gave the one thing in the world that he could not afford to lose, his son, so that we could have eternal life, not just in the future, but right here and right now. It took me a while, and it's still taking me personally a while, but I'm starting to see a better picture of God. And when I look at the world around me, and when I look at all the different gods that people worship, and the different gods that people put up as the main thing in their lives, the stories that they tell, they're the gods of money. They're the gods of sex. They're the gods of security. But I don't want to worship any of those gods. I want to worship the God of heaven and earth, the one in whom I live and breathe and have my being, the one who put the stars in the sky, who hung the planets in their place, who created the heavens and the earth, who put all the animals where they're supposed to be, and who created me out of the dirt and out of the dust. Because here's the secret, and here's the secret that we're going to learn a little bit later on, but I'm going to give it to you a little piece right now, that you and I are dirt creatures. We are creatures created from the mud and from the dust, who have been given the most incredible honor and who have been given the most incredible privilege that any created being in the cosmos could ever receive. God created us to be his partners, to rule and reign in creation, not under him, but alongside him, to be his creation partners. And we're going to discover that more and more as we go along. But here's the thing. God, he's not going to force any of this onto you. I may have painted a pretty big picture, but God, He's a gentleman. He's not going to force any of this on you. It's an invitation. It's not an order. God is waiting for you to step into your story so that He can begin to write that better story with you and through you. You can write a better story than the one the world wants to write for you. That's the powerful part. You don't have to allow all of the things that the world wants for you to crowd into your story. All you need to do is take one step towards God and see what kind of story He might help you write. Over the next few episodes, we're going to explore 4 stories that people have told about themselves throughout history. We're going to go all the way from the banks of the Euphrates River to a tiny village in northern Germany. We're going to see what stories people told about themselves and how the story of Jesus has disrupted and subverted those stories. But more importantly than any of that, over our time together, we're going to discover the story that God wants to write with you and through you. And I, for one, can't wait to find out what that story is.